Welcome back. I think this will be the last of the videos that I make today for this particular week in our discussion of DAOs. I will recommend two additional videos. A TED Talk explaining City DAO, and also, it's a couple of years old now, but I think a really interesting discussion about some of the practical and human issues that arise in relation to the governance of DAOs, which is part of the Coinbase podcast series. I'll refer to both of these a little bit in this particular recording, but I'm going to assume at this stage you haven't looked at those, but I strongly recommend that you do. And our focus in this final recording is going to be on the ethical considerations. I was going to just do ethics in one and risk in another, but I think they overlap. And so I've decided that we're going to talk about ethics and risk at the same time. Before I dive into what I'm talking about when it comes to ethical and risk consideration of DAOs, I think we should just take a moment and think about what ethics are. What does ethics mean? Here, when I'm talking about ethics, I'm referring to the moral principles that guide our behavior and our decision making. In business, ethical considerations are important because they help to ensure that organizations operate in a responsible and a sustainable manner. I'm a big fan of an ethicist called Mary Gentile, who I'll put a reference to some of her materials here. And she's recognized that one of the problems that we have when we teach business students ethics is that as they go out into the real world, we teach all these different ethical frameworks. And depending on what you want the answer to be, you can usually find an ethical framework that will help you get there. Now, I'm not going to plug through the different ethical frameworks as we talk about this. What I'm going to ask you to do is to challenge yourself to think about what are your values? What are your own concepts of what is right and wrong? What is it that you value both from a moral standpoint, but also from a business standpoint? If the closer you are to being able to identify those things, the closer you are to having a sense of what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. And be conscious about applying that lens to your thoughts about what the rules for this emerging business structure can be. I also think that it's important when we talk about risk, ethics and risks are closely entwined. And in fact, most risks that we have are related in some way to our ethical position. So if we're thinking about operational risk, funding risk, compliance, health and safety, reputational risk, to a certain extent, the amount of risk we are prepared to take, the amount of downside that we are prepared to tolerate will, to a certain extent, depend on our ethical positions. So let's have that framework in mind as we think about what the risks are. So what are some of the potential ethical concerns with DAOs or risks that sit in relation to DAOs? One concern is around issues of power and control. Because DAOs are decentralized, it can be really difficult to determine who's ultimately responsible for decisions that are made. This can create power imbalances, and it can make it difficult for stakeholders to hold organizations accountable. Stakeholders inside the organization as well as outside the organization. In the podcast, the Coinbase podcast, there's a brief discussion of the ways in which members of a sushi DAO have dealt with the question of how they actually manage their teams. So members of the DAO, some of them are just investors, some of them are contributing to the software and the products that that DAO is making. And essentially, they talk about issues that arise when a team leader wants to reward their team appropriately and contribute in a particular way, but because they're not getting the voting support of the other DAO members, they found that difficult to do. And I think that is the kind of issue that happens in business all of the time. Particularly in large organizations, if you work in a team, you see and understand the value of your work in ways that other teams and other parts of the organization don't. And with lots of different levels, etc., comes time to tighten our belts and cut costs, there will always be some sort of decisions that are made, and they're made from a very high level, but ultimately areas get cut or other areas get more support. Now, basically, these decisions in a traditional organization are being made by senior managers or even the directors, board members themselves. When these decisions are made by all of the members, the strategy can get lost very easily. And understanding the why and wherefores of each of the decisions that are made, to me, that seems like a very unruly way to run a business or to run a company. So, as my mum used to say to me many years ago, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And I think that's a really interesting question for us to ask when it comes to power and control. Most of the literature is looking at power control from the outside, but I'm actually wondering about what the experience of working from the inside might be. Another key concern is around the potential for DAOs to be used for nefarious purposes. Because DAOs are anonymous and difficult to trace, quite frankly, the internet, as Avenue Q would say, was made for porn and gambling. And we know that blockchain technologies have been used to anonymize transactions to move money around in relation to drug and human trafficking, to do all sorts of things that are not ethical and much less legal. And because those DAOs are anonymous and they're difficult to trace, they can, and if they're used to facilitate illegal activities, so say money laundering or terrorist financing, we can't necessarily work out who is behind them easily. Additionally, because DAOs aren't subject to the same regulatory and legal frameworks as traditional organisations, there is a question about whether they might be more susceptible to abuse. Much of the material that I was talking about in the last recording, when I was looking at the Australian Law Reform Commission report and the Select Senate Committee, for example, much of the concern and hand wringing in relation to that has been around questions about whether or not people who get carried away with the rise and the potential of cryptocurrencies, the extent to which they understand the risks that they're taking and whether they're appropriately informed, and whether those who are selling or promoting those kind of investments are subject to the same level of scrutiny and required to protect investors in the same way. What else? DAOs receive inconsistent regulatory treatment between jurisdictions, particularly in respect of legal personhood, which makes taxing or taxation really uncertain. And again, that by itself can be a really difficult problem. Voting mechanisms. Voting mechanisms rely on token holder participation. And I don't know about you, but when did you last vote at a union when the union asked you to, or at a company shareholder meeting? Now, these things might not necessarily apply to you. When did you last go to an RMIT student union function and vote for the leadership? Actually, even though you can participate in the voting, doesn't necessarily mean that you will. And so we see this all around the world where voting isn't compulsory, that we're only hearing the voices of those that have an interest in the voting mechanism. Again, that may be a good thing, it may not be a good thing. And we're also getting a lot of this information asymmetry where if people are joining DAOs or buying tokens for the investment possibility, the question then becomes whether or not they really understand what it is that they are doing. Anonymity of participants can be an obstacle to policing financial crimes or to allowing for, for enabling action to be taken if there is a breach of contract or if that legal action is required because there is a breach of the law. And the big one again, just because you can use a blockchain to do it, do you really need to? The environmental impact is significant. The quote I have on a slide here, I'm going to read it, you don't need to have a look, comes from the Gomez reading that you've been given. Selena Gomez is a partner at a international firm called Clifford Chance, and I really like her article. It's brief, it hits some really interesting points, and it's really easy to read. But again, she's quoting from Forbes: 78 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere from Ethereum and Bitcoin mining operations together. That's equal to an annual tailpipe emissions of more than 15.5 million cars. Forbes is American. It's talking about American cars. It's talking about the gas guzzlers. That is a significant contribution to climate change, and not in a good way. Now, of course, one of the biggest issues that we've seen when it comes to risk and to ethics has been arisen as a consequence of hacking. There have been many examples of DAOs that have been hacked or exploited for illegal activities. One of the highest profile examples of this, it goes back to 2016, when one of the first DAOs, called the DAO, was attacked. Basically what happened is that there was a vulnerability in the DAO's code, and the attacker exploited this vulnerability, ultimately stealing millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency. This incident highlighted a range of things, including both the potential security risks associated with DAOs, but also what it means if a self-executing contract, a smart contract, has an error in it that results in it executing in accordance with its code, but delivering an outcome that was not what was intended or expected. So the DAO, it was a decentralized autonomous organization. It was launched in 2016 on the Ethereum blockchain, and so within a year of Ethereum being launched, it raised about 150 million US dollars worth of Ether through a token sale within 3 months of its launch. But then it was hacked as a consequence of these vulnerabilities, and $60 million worth of Ether was stolen. Ultimately, the blockchain ended up being hard forked. In fact, the issues with the DAO ended up resulting in the hard fork that resulted, and I've spoken about this before, the creation of Ethereum Classic and the current version of Ethereum that we know. Basically, so we've got now these two distinct blockchains, largely arising out of the way that different investors, holders, token holders is probably the better word for it, responded to what had happened. So initially, Vitalik Buterin, you remember him, he's the one who explains about smart contracts being a vending machine in one of the earlier recordings that we have. He started off by proposing that there should be just a soft fork in the Ethereum network to effectively blacklist this attacker and prevent them from moving stolen funds from one place to another. But the attacker, or someone posing as the attacker, we're never really going to know, and it's never been verified whether it was the person who actually stole the money or not. Basically, anyway, somebody saying they were the attacker sent an open letter to the Ethereum community claiming that actually, even though they've exploited vulnerability, it's still a legal holding of these funds, or the funds have gone to them legally, because essentially they've just used the code. They've basically exploited the rules as set out in the smart contract. And basically this particular attacker said, hey, I'm going to sue you if you attempt to take the money back, because effectively it's a smart contract, it's executed the way it was written. Sure, you didn't think it was going to do it that way, but I was smart enough to read the code. Money's come to me, it's a smart contract, it's self-executing, so I win. So this is a good example in a way of an ethical risk. There was a bug in the code that meant that the smart contract didn't do what people thought it was going to do or what was expected. But at the same time, the bug was identified, and the argument is a somewhat legalistic one. The code did what a person skilled in the art of reading the code expected it to do, and accordingly, according to the so-called hacker anyway, exploiting the bug was legal. So tensions get really heightened. Shortly after this open letter, they're heightened even further when the alleged attacker, or someone posing as them, claimed through an intermediary on the DAO's Slack channel that they were going to attempt to thwart any soft fork by bribing Ethereum miners not to comply. The bribe, let's call it what it was a bribe, basically was a collective reward of 1 million Ether and 100 Bitcoin. So ultimately, this is what led to the Ethereum network being split in two. Situation not only presented technical challenges, but it questioned the ethical, the moral, the philosophical underpinnings of the technology. And it also basically challenged the resilience of the Ethereum project's leadership. Before the Ethereum community could proceed with Vitalik's soft fork proposal, a bug was then discovered in the update code, making it vulnerable to attack. It's like a soap opera, isn't it? So ultimately, the solution that came up, the second solution, was a hard fork. It was proposed, and ultimately, after much debate, it was executed. So what the hard fork did is it effectively rolled back the Ethereum network's history to before the time of the DAO attack and reallocated the DAO's Ether to a different smart contract so the investors could withdraw their funds. It was super controversial at the time. After all, blockchains are supposed to be immutable, right? And they're supposed to be censorship resistant. It was really unclear for a while whether that hard fork was ever going to be executed. It was proposed by Ethereum developers, so they didn't actually have the unilateral power to implement the change. The miners, the exchanges, and the node operators all had to agree to update their software. There was a lot of heated debate on public forums, including Slack, Discord, Facebook, and Twitter, all of the socials. And basically, after that debate, essentially the rollback happened on the 20th of July 2016, and the hard fork was implemented basically by rolling back to block 192,000. And anything that had happened after that time was basically ignored. But that's how we ended up with the two. Classic, so the people who didn't go to the rollback, and everybody else. So the vast majority of stakeholders adopted the change and the fork was implemented. Clearly not everybody was on board, and that's why we've got those two competing and now totally separate Ethereum blockchains. The people who refused to accept the hard fork that rolled back the blockchain's history, basically they're the Ethereum Classic, ETC mod. The blockchain presently known as Ethereum is the blockchain that implemented the hard fork, and the one known as Ethereum Classic was the one that didn't. Though the funds stolen from the DAO were restored to its investors, the attacker didn't lose out entirely. The stolen tokens still remained in their possession on the Ethereum Classic chain and were worth about $8.5 million in Ethereum Classic in the few months following the attack. They've gone up and down significantly since then. The DAO hack and the subsequent Ethereum hard fork really shook the blockchain community at the time, particularly the Ethereum community, and it highlighted major questions about this emerging blockchain technology. In retrospect, it's clear that the decision that Vitalik Buterin, Ethereum developers, and the global community ensured the survival of the blockchain in its earliest days. But since the DAO hack, Ethereum has gone on to essentially be a pillar of blockchain. It's it is seen as a leader in that governance space. It'd be really interesting to see what would happen if that kind of issue happened again. Of course, just because they sorted it out themselves doesn't mean that it was sorted out forever. A year later, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US came out with this response. They said that tokens offered and sold by the virtual organization known as the DAO were securities and therefore subject to federal securities laws. The report confirms that, this is the SEC's report, the report confirms that issuers of the distributed ledger or the blockchain technology-based securities must register offers and sales of those securities unless a valid exemption applies. Those participating in unregistered offerings may also be liable for violations of the security laws. In other words, the DAO's offering of those tokens was subject to the same regulatory principles that companies undergoing initial public offerings are subject to. So according to the SEC, the DAO violated federal securities laws along with all of its investors. Now, this is really interesting because, for those of you who have thought about this, it will not surprise you to know that if a company asks people to invest money in it at any time, whether it's at an initial public offering stage or because it's listed on a stock exchange and its shares can be bought and sold, there is a high level of regulation around that process. And that's because there is this information asymmetry. If I am trying to raise investment funds, I'm in a much better position than potential investors are to know what the risks are associated with investing in my company or my business or whatever it happens to be. And the SEC basically said, well, this is actually akin to a security. By issuing tokens that people are paying for, even if they're not paying for them with actual cash, if they're paying for them with cryptocurrency, which, let's face it, you either earn by mining or you pay money to a miner for it or to somebody else who paid money to a miner for it. Ultimately, you're paying something of value for that currency or that crypto, and so it is an investment, and so you should understand what the risks are associated with that investment. So though the DAO project has ultimately folded, wouldn't you know it, its impact is ongoing. Current blockchain development teams continually look to the DAO's example for guidance, basically for what not to do. So the DAO teaches us a few valuable lessons about the importance of establishing a secure blockchain platform. The DAO's hack wasn't due to a problem inherent on the Ethereum blockchain. It came from a coding loophole that was exploited by a smart hacker. Had the code been written correctly, the hack could have been avoided. Secondly, the SEC's ruling on the DAO has encouraged blockchain startups to come up with ways of avoiding security registration and federal regulation in the USA. One of the ways companies do this is by using something called the SAFT method, S-A-F-T. If tokens have a legitimate utilitarian value on a blockchain platform, then they violate a component of what is called the Howey case and therefore cannot be listed as securities or regulated by the SEC. So effectively, in the US at least, there is this kind of loophole that developers are using to try and stay out of the regulated market. But again, that raises another ethical issue for us, doesn't it? It raises the issue of whether or not investors should be protected and what level of transparency should be about. So without the DAO, who knows what lessons would still need to be taught. I have misjudged how long it is going to take me to talk to you about this, so I'm going to stop this recording right now. I'm going to ask if you've got questions, concerns, frustrations, or anything that you want to compliment me about. And in the next video, I'm going to start talking a little bit more about what we can do to overcome these problems. I look forward to seeing you there.